All right, get your fingers ready for the rage typing. I hate to do it, but you love to complain about it. It's time to update the top 25. We are through week 12 of the 2024 college football season, heading into week 13. We're just 2 weeks away from rivalry weekend, Thanksgiving coming up. So we got some great games over the next couple of weeks. All of the conference championship games are still kind of up in the air. Between 3, 4, in some cases 5 or 6 different teams. So it's going to be an exciting end of the season. But I am ready to update my top 25. Here it is. All right. Let me ask y'all something. Do y'all make any distinction between like what would be the top 25 teams in your mind versus how you would rank a playoff rating or ranking? I was thinking about that earlier today because, of course, I'm going to do a separate playoff ranking. A separate playoff ranking video. And I don't know, are the qualifications the same in your mind for like just a generic top 25 ranking versus how you would rank the playoffs? I'm just curious what y'all think about that as I sit down here after I record this to start working on my playoff rankings. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm getting at with that as we go through today's video. But unchanged here, 1 through 4, Oregon, Ohio State, Indiana, and Texas. Oregon, not all that impressive on the road at Wisconsin, 16-13. They get the win. Offense did not look good for Oregon. They're, of course, without one of their best wide receivers, Tez Johnson, so I'm not sure how much of an issue that might be going forward, but they have looked impressive, Oregon, for the majority of the season, and they, of course, have one of, if not the best wins of the season against Ohio State earlier in the year. So it's hard to really consider anyone else for the number one spot right now in my mind. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that I think Oregon is the best team in college football. That's not really how I do my ranking. This is a combination of kind of like where they deserve to be ranked, which is based off of their record, their schedule, who they have beaten, if they have any losses, who did they lose to, those kinds of things. And it just feels like Oregon right now is really the only team I think that should be considered for a number one ranking. I've got Ohio State at number 2. I think they're one of the most talented teams in the country. They won again this past weekend. They beat Northwestern 31-7, and I watched a lot of that game, all of the first half. And this isn't the first time I've noticed this with Ohio State. Ohio State the first quarter, for example, when you watched Ohio State in the first quarter against Northwestern, it's obvious that they're good. You look out there and you see playmakers and NFL talent all over the field on both sides of the ball, but then you look at the scoreboard and it doesn't necessarily reflect that. But then the second quarter happens. And I've seen this multiple times with Ohio State, whether it be in the second quarter or one particular quarter or another during the game. I think it was 21 points they scored in the second quarter. When it starts clicking for Ohio State at whatever point that is during the game, whatever, 10, 15-minute stretch or a quarter stretch or whatever it is, they are something to see and extremely hard to stop. And they have the ability, Ohio State does, to end a game quickly at any point during the game. It's kind of like watching the Mike Tyson, Jake Paul disaster circus show was this past weekend. And watching Ohio State is kind of like watching a boxer who might not be the most technically sound boxer on the planet, and it's probably not a good idea if they have to go 12 rounds or something. They might not win on a decision in the end if it comes down to that. But at any point during that 12-round boxing match, they have the ability to take 1 minute or so out of any of those rounds and destroy you and end you and knock you out. And it's like that. And the second quarter against Northwestern was that for Ohio State. The game was over in about a 10-minute period in the second quarter there. And again, I've seen Ohio State do this multiple times. So is it complacency? Is it boredom? Is it playing down to the level of your competition sometimes? It's probably a little bit of all of that. But Ohio State, there's no denying their talent, and their ceiling is a national title. Ohio State has a team and a roster that could potentially win a national title. Now, so do 4, 5, 6, whatever other teams too. But the point is, I think Ohio State is really good. I've got them at number 2. This is where it starts to get tricky for me, and this is one of the reasons I brought up in the beginning. If you guys differentiate in your mind between how you would rank teams in a traditional top 25 week by week, which is what we're doing here, versus how you would rank for playoff rankings. Like if the playoffs were starting today, as an example, right? Indiana is undefeated and they're in the Big Ten. And to me, that means something. I get it that they haven't played a gauntlet of a schedule, right? They don't have any ranked wins. I understand that. The best team they've played, maybe Nebraska, and they blew them out. They beat Michigan, and in most years, that would have been a program-defining win for Indiana. We all know Michigan is a shell of what they normally are this year. So I understand all the arguments sort of against Indiana, especially in comparison to other teams with worse records. Whether you're talking the Ole Miss at 7, Alabama at 8, Georgia at 9, even Tennessee at 10. All of those teams have a win or multiple wins that are better than any win Indiana has. And that's true. That's a fact. You can't argue against that. That is a fact. The argument comes when you try to use that to determine where a team like Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, whatever, should be ranked in comparison with Indiana, right? And that's so top 25 versus playoff ranking. Is there a difference in your mind in how you would rank teams when you do that? But I've got Indiana at 3. Now, they've got a chance to prove both sides of the coin, right or wrong, this coming week. They play on the road at Ohio State. And kind of the popular sort of opinion or theory floating around out there, or question maybe, about Indiana is, okay, obviously if they beat Ohio State, that answers everybody's question. They would probably move up to number 2 in the country at that point, right? They'd be undefeated with a win over Ohio State. That would pretty much end the debate on Indiana right there, were they to go on the road and beat Ohio State in Columbus. But what if they lose? Well, if they lose, the question becomes much more complicated, right? Do they lose by 3 or do they lose by 33? Now, obviously, those are two extremes. If they lose by 3, that's an extremely close game. They will drop because that's what happens when you lose in top 25 rankings. You lose a game, you drop. But they probably won't drop that far. They probably wouldn't drop out of the top 10. Definitely wouldn't drop out of the top 12 or top 15, right? If it's a 1, 2, 3-point game, something like that. And then obviously if they lose by 4 or 5 touchdowns, then, well, the debate's kind of over on Indiana. They would fall out of the top 12 and probably, lose whatever hope they had at the playoff. But what if they lose by 10 or 13 or 14? Or what if they're down 7 in the fourth quarter and they're mounting a comeback, but they throw a pick 6 with a minute to go in the game and lose by 14? Something like that is going to make it a lot more complicated because you're going to have people say, well, they only played one ranked team and they lost by 14. And then you're going to have somebody else saying, they played on the road at Ohio State and were one play away from tying the game up until that pick 6 at the end. So I think it's going to depend how that game plays out, I think, where Indiana ends up ranked beyond this week. But I've got them at 3. They're undefeated. I've got Texas at 4. I was not all that impressed with Texas this weekend on the road at Arkansas. Now, defensively, I thought Texas played well. Arkansas, at times, has shown the ability to field a really good offense this year. But defensively, Arkansas has been mostly a mess this season. And they held Texas in check for large parts of this game. Texas ends up winning 20-10. Texas still searching for a ranked win. Texas has an Indiana problem. Texas has played one ranked team this year, Georgia. It was a home game for Texas, and they lost by 2 touchdowns. Now, Texas is still ranked really high. Will Indiana get the same treatment? We'll see. What happens if Texas loses a second game? Texas is in danger of missing the playoffs if they lose to Texas A&M, and that might sound crazy with 2 weeks to go in the regular season, and you see Texas ranked in everybody's top 5 with 1 loss, and you're thinking, how in the hell, with 1 loss in a rivalry game at the end, could they fall all the way out of the playoff picture? Well, Texas A&M is going to be the only other ranked team they've played. If at the end of the year, the Texas resume is 10 wins against unranked teams, 2 losses against the only 2 ranked teams that they played, and they lost the last game of the regular season, and they didn't make the SEC title game and all of that, it's very possible, especially when you start to look at the kind of train wreck of 2 lost teams in the SEC, every 2-loss team in the SEC would have better wins than Texas at that point. They could and should fall all the way back behind Tennessee if they lose to Texas A&M in a couple of weeks, they play Kentucky this week. So Kentucky too. If they lose at any game, they're a massive favorite over Kentucky. The game at the end of the year at Texas A&M will be much closer, or at least the odds, the spread will be much closer. A much more competitive game expected there. But I've got Texas at 4. I've got Penn State at 5. Again, they're no different than Texas. They've played one ranked team and they lost. Now, it's a close loss at home to Ohio State, who most people think is a top 5 team. So are you judging Penn State on that loss? This is where I start to run into an issue. Not like an issue with Penn State, but this is where I'll just be honest, it gets hard for me. When the best thing you can say about a team is that they lost to somebody, how good are they, really? It's hard to know. I think Penn State's a top 15 team for sure. And I've got them ranked 5. Again, this isn't a power rating, so I don't think Penn State's the 5th best team in the country. I'm trying to rank teams here where I feel like they deserve to be ranked based off of their record, who they've beaten, who they've lost to, all of those kinds of things. But it's a fair question. Like, you look at Texas and you go, if you ask somebody to justify to you, why is Texas in the top 5? The first thing they're going to say is, well, they only lost to Georgia by 14. You ask them about Penn State. Well, they only lost to Ohio State by 7. In other words, that's the first thing about them. Like, that's the best thing. It gets tricky, especially if either one of those teams catches a second loss. Like, they're not making the playoffs for sure, Texas or Penn State, with a second loss, because they don't have any ranked win to help offset any of those losses. And it makes it very tricky to rank these teams. I've got Notre Dame at 6. Again, every team we get to has massive questions and arguments on both sides of one point or another. With Notre Dame, they're 8-1, 9-1, 9-1. They beat Virginia 35-14, beat Florida State a couple of weeks ago. They get a shot against undefeated Navy this coming week. But they've got the worst loss of anybody in the top 25, never mind the top 10 or the playoff contending teams. They've got by far the worst loss of any team in the top 25. And on top of that, they avoid a 13th game, a potential conference championship game, which in theory could result in their second loss, which in theory could remove them from the playoff picture. They avoid all that because they're not in a conference. What is Notre Dame's best win? Well, they beat Texas A&M early in the year. They beat a previously ranked Navy no longer ranked, and they get a chance with Army. They get Southern Cal coming up at the end of the year. So it's not a terrible schedule, but it's not the best schedule in the world either. And that Northern Illinois loss stands out like a sore thumb, but I've got them at 6. I've got Ole Miss at 7. Again, questions here too. They've got a good win. That win against Georgia at home is very impressive. They've also got a couple of bad losses. I mean, they lost to Kentucky. So where do you slot them in? It's hard to know. Do I think Ole Miss would beat Alabama today? No. I think Alabama right now is a better team than Ole Miss. Well, why don't you have Alabama ranked ahead of Ole Miss then? I try to keep my opinion out of it if I can. What do I know for sure about Alabama and Ole Miss? Well, they've each played Georgia. Bama beat them by 1 touchdown. Ole Miss beat them by 18. So I give Ole Miss the nod there and have them 1 spot ahead of Bama. I've got Georgia at 9. Do I think Ole Miss is 18 points better than Georgia? No. On a neutral field especially? No. I think Georgia would have a good chance to beat them. They may lose again. It would be a good game. Same with Bama. But Georgia lost to Ole Miss and Bama. You can't ignore them. I'm not going to ignore that. So there's no way. And I know Georgia had a big win this past week at home against Tennessee, but I can't move them ahead of Ole Miss and Bama. All 4 of those teams have 2 losses. But then you say, well, why don't you have Tennessee ahead of Bama? Well, because Georgia beat Tennessee, and I can't put Georgia ahead of Bama. Therefore, I can't put Tennessee ahead of Georgia. So am I saying all that to say that this is the right way to rank these 4 teams? No, I have no idea how to rank these 4 teams. I think all 4 of these teams are 4 of the best 10 teams in the country, though. I do think that. But in terms of how to rank them, where and how, it's impossible to know. Ole Miss has only played one of them, Georgia, and they beat them. So you got to have Ole Miss ahead of Georgia. Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama have all played each other, and they all beat each other. Bama beat Georgia. Georgia beat Tennessee. Tennessee beat Bama. So it's a circle. of there. So I don't know how to rank them. So there you go. That's how I came down on that. Alabama played an elementary school this week. They play Oklahoma this coming week. Georgia beat Tennessee. They play an elementary school this coming week. Tennessee, of course, lost to Georgia and plays an elementary school this coming weekend. I've got Boise State at 11. I think right now they're the best group of 5 team, although Tulane is coming on strong. It looks like Tulane and Army will probably play for a conference championship. They're in the same conference. So it looks like whether Army beats Notre Dame or not is irrelevant to this conversation. Tulane and Army are in the same conference. They're likely going to play in a conference championship game. It's going to be the winner of that game or Boise State, who will be the highest ranked group of 5 team. I've also got UNLV ranked, but I don't see them getting in right now. Shout out to UNLV, though, Uncle Lou's hometown team at 23. But I think Boise State is a better team right now than either Tulane or Army. They've got a high-profile player, which I think helps, unfortunately, in terms of where they may or may not end up being ranked. I'm not saying that's right, but that's just reality. And if they win out, including their conference championship game, I do think they will be the group of 5 representative in the college football playoff. I've got Miami at 12, and I thought about moving them down further than that. They have a loss and 0 good wins. They had a good win against Louisville, but Louisville lost to Stanford this past week. Louisville's no longer ranked. Again, it doesn't matter where a team was ranked when you played them. It kind of amazes me how many people get hung up on that idea. But I mean, I can give you a great example. Georgia Tech beat Florida State in week 0. That's not a ranked win. Okay. Florida State was ranked in the top 10 way back in week 0. Georgia Tech beat them. Well, we now know what Florida State is, and they're a terrible team. You don't get credit for what a team used to be ranked. You get your credit for what a team is ranked now. Another example, Georgia beat Clemson in week 1, right? Clemson was ranked 12 or 13, something like that. That doesn't matter. Georgia has a win over the 18th ranked team in my ranking, Clemson. Like, I don't get to give Georgia a better win because Clemson used to be ranked higher. That is irrelevant. And there's a million examples. I could go through the other teams and list examples too. But what a team is ranked now is what matters. And Miami just doesn't have any good wins. They've got what I think is a pretty bad loss to Georgia Tech. Now, it doesn't matter. Again, they're in the ACC. They're headed to the ACC championship game unless they completely drop the ball. They play Wake Forest and then I think Syracuse to end the year. They win those 2. They're in the ACC championship game against most likely SMU, who I've got ranked 13th. Little disappointed in SMU this weekend. They only won by 10 against a pretty bad Boston College team that was playing their backup quarterback. But again, doesn't matter. They get to the ACC championship game and win it. They're in the playoff. Doesn't matter where they're ranked here. This is not a playoff ranking, obviously. So it looks like Miami and SMU for the ACC championship. I know Clemson also has 2 losses, but their common opponent is Louisville, and Clemson lost to Louisville, whereas SMU beat Louisville. So that's where SMU holds the tiebreaker right now over Clemson. I've got South Carolina at 14. They're one of the hottest teams in the country right now. South Carolina right now reminds me a lot of the 2008 Georgia team. Georgia in 2008 lost a couple of games early in the year. And back then we didn't even have a 4-team playoff, never mind a 12. We just picked 2 teams at the end of the year and made them play for a national title. But Georgia lost a couple of games early in the season in 2008. But over the last 6 or 7 weeks of the season in 2008, there's an argument to be made that they were the best team in the country. They absolutely destroyed everybody they played from the middle of October on. But it didn't matter because they lost too many games early in the season, so their chance at a national title never really existed. And for South Carolina, I think they're going to meet a similar fate. They've got 3 losses, and boy, that LSU loss, which that game was basically stolen from South Carolina, but that LSU loss is looming really large now because South Carolina's playing some really good football. They've had a good defense for the majority of the year, but their offense now is starting to play pretty good. Our buddy Urkel, their quarterback, Lenore Sellers, had 5 touchdowns this past weekend in a big win for them against Missouri. South Carolina quietly having a really, really good season. I've got them at 14. They, of course, get a shot at Clemson here at Clemson here coming up in a couple of weeks. They play an elementary school this weekend, Wofford. I've got Army at 15. Just talked about them in relationship to the college football playoff. They got a showdown with Notre Dame coming up, which is really irrelevant to Army's playoff chances, honestly. Army needs to win their conference championship game to get into the playoffs. The Army-Notre Dame game is huge in that if they beat Notre Dame, it will knock Notre Dame out for sure. So it's still a big game, but doesn't necessarily pertain to Army's playoff chances, as they'll have a chance to get into the playoffs by beating Tulane in the conference championship game. But I've got Army at 15. They play Notre Dame, like I mentioned, this coming week. And they're coming off a bye week, so they've had a couple of weeks to prepare. We'll see if they can give Notre Dame a tougher test than Navy did a few weeks ago, where Notre Dame just completely blew them out. I've got Texas A&M at 16. I don't think Texas A&M is a great team, but they're 8-2. They got a shot still to make it to the SEC championship game. If they beat Texas, then you're going to have a complete mess in the SEC. Texas A&M only has one SEC loss, right? They lost to Notre Dame in week 1, so one of their losses is non-con. So that's why whoever wins the Texas A&M Texas game is going to the SEC championship, because they'll be the only SEC team with just the one loss. They played an elementary school this past weekend and won 38-3. They play on the road at a terrible Auburn team this coming week. So barring some sort of massive upset by Auburn over Texas A&M or Kentucky over Texas, then that Texas A&M game in 2 weeks is going to be absolutely huge. But I've got Texas A&M at 16. BYU at 17 after a pretty bad loss to a 5-win Kansas team this week. A lot of people kind of saw this coming. The hard part was figuring out when it was coming. BYU's been a small favorite, and people have been kind of picking against them for a long time. There's a lot of people out there that just don't believe at all in BYU, think they're not even a top 25 team, never mind top 10, which is where they've been ranked the last couple of weeks. And all of that finally caught up with them. They took a loss this past weekend to Kansas. They're still on track to make the Big 12 title game, so could potentially get in the playoffs if they win the Big 12 championship game against either Colorado or Arizona State, depending on how that conference shakes out. I've got Clemson at 18. 8-2. Clemson, under normal conditions, would probably be ranked a little higher and have a shot maybe at getting into the playoffs, but they've just lost bad to the best two teams that they've played this year. And unfortunately, I think that's going to keep them out. Unless something weird happens in the ACC and Clemson is able to get into the ACC championship game and win it, I don't think Clemson's headed to the playoffs this year. Got Colorado at 19 and Arizona State at 20. One of those two is most likely going to the college football or the Big 12 championship game. Colorado's a game ahead of Arizona State right now. Arizona State beat Kansas State this past weekend. They play BYU this weekend, though. So if they beat BYU, then you're probably looking at Arizona State versus Colorado in the Big 12 championship game. And Arizona State, like South Carolina, is a team that lost a game or two early in the season, and everybody kind of pushed them to the side and quit paying attention. And they've been getting better each and every week. Colorado has too, actually. So those are two teams I think that are sort of better maybe than some people think, Colorado and Arizona State. And we may get a chance to see them play here in a couple of weeks. Tulane at 21, already talked about that. Iowa State at 22. I think this is the fourth time Iowa State's been in and then out of my top 25. But this week they're in. They're 8-2. They beat Cincinnati 34-17. They play on the road at a bad Utah team this coming week. UNLV back in the top 25 for the first time since week 4 or 5, I think, when they lost to, I believe it was Boise State. But they beat San Diego State this past weekend 41-20. They play San Jose State this coming up weekend. Washington State finally caught their second loss of the year. They were the most not talked about one-loss team in the country heading into last week. Washington State was, but they finally lost their second game. They're now 8-2. They lost to a bad New Mexico team, 5-win New Mexico team, 38-35. They play at Oregon State this coming week. And then Illinois back in the top 25, 7-3. A good year for Illinois. They're not making the playoffs. They're not winning the Big Ten. I get all that. And I'm not trying to tell you they're great, but it's Illinois we're talking about here. And they're 7-3. They beat Michigan State. They play on the road at Rutgers this coming week. So in all likelihood will improve to 8-3 and potential to get to 9 wins in the regular season. And depending on what bowl game they get matched up with, could end up with a 10-win season. So good job, Brett Bielema there at Illinois this year. But there you go. That's my top 25. Be sure and let me know down below where I'm wrong. And I will try later today to get out my playoff rankings video. If for some reason I don't get it out this afternoon, I'll have it out tomorrow morning. I've got an appointment at 4 o'clock this afternoon. So We'll have to see how much time I have. But I do appreciate you watching. Hit the thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and have a good morning.